From the factory, the brakes on a 2004 Mustang V6 are decent for daily driving, but under autocross conditions their limits are exceeded pretty easily. A lot of people assume you need to upgrade to massive rotors with 4 or 6 piston calipers to get these cars to stop. Cobra R front brake kits, Brembos, Willwoods, Bear brakes, they cost anywhere from $1,200 to $3,200, and they're great options if you're using your Mustang for road racing or track days. But the only course the ST is going to see is an autocross course, and if you're building an autocross-only Mustang, you can get much better braking without breaking the bank. The brakes are the most powerful weapon a driver has. When you brake, how hard you brake, your duration of braking, and how effective your brakes are all factor into your times. The front brakes do the majority of the work in any car. Luckily, Ford built a greatly improved front brake setup for the 99 to 04 Mustangs, factory Cobra brakes. The 94 to 04 Cobras came with 13-inch front rotors and larger 2-piston calipers. You can find calipers used on eBay or buy new aftermarket versions from the various Mustang parts suppliers. I've bought 2 sets of refurbished factory calipers from MPS Auto Salvage. They do an awesome job and the calipers always function and look great. In my experience, the Ford factory calipers are better overall quality than the aftermarket pieces, but they are getting very hard to find. These calipers were also used on Bullet and Mach 1 Mustangs. Best of all, they bolt right up to my 2004 V6 spindles. PowerStop makes a really good set of 13-inch cross-drilled and slotted rotors. They are 2 inches larger than the stock 11-inch rotors, which means much more surface area for the pads to grip, and they allow for better cooling, which means better braking. These have a nice silver zinc coating on them to prevent rust in the areas not touching the pads. The main concern with cross-drilled and slotted rotors is that they crack around the holes, and if you use them for track days they probably will, but I've used these rotors for 5 seasons of autocross and I've never had an issue. Brake pads are a very personal choice. How you brake factors in a lot. I went with Hawk HP Plus pads. They're a ferrocarbon pad that offers tremendous bite, consistent brake feel, and a 100 to 800 degree heat range. They're designed for autocross and the compound resists fading. Best of all, you can drive to and from the events on these pads. Russell Performance has been making braided stainless steel brake lines for years. I'm using their kit for the 99 to 04 Cobras because the rear brake lines for an IRS are different than a solid axle. Braided stainless steel lines allow for much better pedal feel and consistency than the stock rubber hoses. Plus, the rubber hoses on this car were pretty old. I don't want to be worrying about them when I'm heading into a braking zone at 60 miles per hour. In the rear, I'm also using factory Cobra brakes. They use an 11.65-inch vented rotor as opposed to the stock 10.5-inch solid rear rotor. The rotors are made by Xtreme Stop and the pads are Hawk HP Plus. If you're swapping an IRS into a V6, there's a brake line issue you need to be aware of. If your V6 doesn't have ABS or traction control, you will have to make a custom passenger side rear brake caliper hose, as well as a new rear brake crossover line. From the factory, non-ABS traction control cars have one hard line going to the rear. That line goes into the passenger side rear caliper hose via one port, then a second line in a second port goes across the car to the driver's side rear caliper hose. There are 2 problems with this setup. Problem 1, every Cobra came with ABS and traction control, which means each rear brake caliper hose has only one port, so the Russell Performance braided stainless steel line for the rear passenger side won't work. Problem 2, the factory V6 hardline crossover between the rear caliper hoses interferes with the IRS upper control arms. Luckily for me, a local company was able to make a dual-port Cobra-style rear passenger side DOT-rated braided stainless steel line, and a new braided stainless steel crossover line. I fabbed up some mounting plates that attach to the solid axle upper control arm mounts to keep the braided line from interfering with any moving parts. The custom lines cost around $200, but they absolutely saved my project. If you're going to tackle a V6 IRS swap, it's easier to do in a car with ABS and traction control. But, in my opinion, you don't want either of those in an autocross Mustang. You definitely want to use speed bleeders in the front and rear calipers. Russell Performance makes these, and they make bleeding your brakes a lot easier. They also help protect you from a common problem on refurbished or aftermarket brake calipers: no sealant on the threads of the bleeder. Without sealant, you will absolutely have a leak, and if you tighten the bleeder too much trying to stop it, you'll break the threads out of the aluminum. With speed bleeders, you don't have to keep tightening and loosening the bleeder when bleeding your brakes. A check ball prevents air from getting in as you pump the pedal. Just loosen the bleeder, pump the pedal until the fluid has no bubbles, then tighten the bleeder and you're good to go. I'm about $1,200 all in, front and rear, including the custom rear brake lines. And my car stops when I need it to. That's the key. Autocrossing is often more about eliminating braking than applying the brakes. You want to use your brakes as little as possible. Less braking equals less heat. So having 4 or 6 piston brakes that don't fade when they're hot isn't really necessary. With more pistons, you're just paying to solve a problem you shouldn't have on a 30 to 90 second autocross course. But you do want to brake as late as possible for the shortest amount of time possible, which means you need good bite. And bite is more about pads than pistons. Everything Ford got wrong with the stock calipers, they got right with the Cobra calipers. They use larger pads, larger pistons, and they are much easier to service. The Power Stop and Xtreme Stop cross-drilled and slotted rotors come with basic instructions. They are labeled driver and passenger side because the direction of the holes and slots matters. Both companies make great rotors. Depending on the pad you use, the holes and slots will get clogged with brake dust and you need to clean them out at least once a season. The Hawk HP Plus pads don't come with installation instructions, but they do come with break-in procedure instructions. It's really important to follow them because you want the pads to function at their best. These pads give off a tremendous amount of brake dust, and they will wear out your rotors faster than less aggressive pads. The Russell Performance braided stainless steel brake lines are simple to install. Just make sure you have line wrenches to use on the fittings and don't over-tighten the banjo bolts. Even though these parts are sourced from different vendors, you're essentially installing a kit because swapping to a Cobra front brake setup requires changing your rotors, calipers, pads, and hoses. Up front, the install takes about an hour and a half. The same thing goes for the rear. Having a disc brake tool to screw the rear piston in will make the install of the pads a lot easier. The rear brake swap will take about an hour and a half. The more you autocross, the less you use your brakes. But the harder you push your car, the more likely you are to need your brakes when you make a mistake. These mods change every single braking characteristic on the car. The bite is instantaneous and sharp. They will put you through the windshield if you slam on the pedal. The pedal feel is very firm, not at all spongy. The braking is consistent and composed, no fade and no flutter. You only have to kick the pedal for a split second to plant the nose or slow the car down. That decreases your duration of braking and allows you to brake as late as possible. Less braking equals less time on course. The Cobra calipers, Power Stop and Xtreme Stop rotors, Hawk HP Plus pads, and the Russell Performance braided stainless steel brake lines and speed bleeders will get your stallion to stop with confidence and consistency. And because they don't cost a fortune, they'll stop on a dime and give you change back.